What should people know about the Kensington Runestone and the Hookadex, Scott?
Okay. Well, the whole thing started for me back in July of 2000 when I was asked to perform a forensic study on the Kensington Runestone, which at the time I'd never heard of it. I didn't know what it was. And, they were pretty excited about it, but, I get a lot of interesting projects. And when I started it, I really wasn't all that concerned about it or that impressed, and I just did my work. And then when I finished and presented the findings, I thought that people would be happy. I thought to myself, well, they got one, good for them. And quite frankly, I was ready to move on, and get done with this because it was a long project. And when I presented my findings, there were many people who questioned me, criticized me, and then attacked me, and and I didn't take that too well. So anyway, that's what launched me into this further investigation. But the stone was found in 1898 by a Swedish immigrant farmer named Olof Ullman, who was clearing trees on his land in western Minnesota, and he tipped over this 25 to 30-year-old aspen tree, and tightly wrapped in the roots of that tree was this 202-pound stone with a long inscription carved in runes, hence the name Runestone. Although I think people in Sweden probably know what that is. I'm used to explaining that over here in America because
Sure.
we don't have them dotting the countryside like you do.
Well, let me, not to cut you off there, but it's an increasingly disappearing knowledge, let me tell you, because so much of it is actually actively being suppressed. But we'll get to that later, Scott. Please go ahead.
I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah.
Anyway, back in 1898, it was looked at by some scholars, and, looking back now, understanding what I do now, I realized that these people didn't have a chance of figuring out what the runestone was. I mean, they saw many characters that they were able to understand, and words and phrases they were able to decipher, but there's so much more going on within the inscription that they really had no chance at that time. And quite frankly, I don't think any of the runologists living today understand what they're dealing with either. And what I see is people that have a knowledge base, and I'm talking about people like Henrik Williams, who's a very bright guy, certainly knows things about runes, but the knowledge base that he has and others have is set. And I think what happens is that they take a look at the runestone, they say, okay, this is what I know. This is a runestone, so it must fit into this box of knowledge that I have.
Yeah.
And right at the start, they're off on the wrong foot, because that's not the way you do a scientific investigation. And I hear them use this word all the time. A scientific investigation is no preconceived ideas. You can obviously have a knowledge base, but you look at this thing with blinders on, and you just start to record data or information and let the artifact, or the inscription in this case, tell you what it is. And that's really the fundamental problem with the investigations of the past. They didn't follow proper scientific method. And that's really what I came to realize as I started to research the researchers, because I wanted to understand, how come they're not seeing what I see, what to me is obvious? So that's really one of the things that I concluded. So, we looked at the runestone, we found layers of information within it, not just the inscription that everybody sees. There are punch marks, there are short strokes, there are things that were added to the inscription after the carver carved the main text. And these are codes, they are secondary messages and layers to this thing that, if you're strictly looking at it in a sense of the Scandinavian runestones that you guys are so familiar with, you're going to struggle, because that's not what this is. The context is completely different. The timing is different. We're talking about a medieval inscription. Why they keep talking about Vikings and the Kensington Runestone, I never understood that. But it's been bungled, and they just never got it right, because by and large they didn't follow proper scientific method.
Tell us a little bit, Scott, what you discovered obviously on the stone and what method you used to be able to decipher it pretty much.
Well, as far as the language goes, that's not something that I'm an expert in. I learned an awful lot from my co-author, Dick Nielsen, and I learned a lot from Henrik Williams and others, Professor Michael Barnes in the British Isles, and others who taught me enough to be extremely dangerous, but obviously I'm not an expert. And so I understand the text a little bit, but for me, being a geologist, it's the physical aspects of the stone, it's the chemical aspects of the minerals inside the stone, the weathering, the calcite, all this stuff that, is my forte. And so I have a very good grasp of the geological aspects of the stone and the weathering. But, I'm not the first geologist to look at the stone. The first geologist to look at the Kensington Runestone was a guy by the name of Professor Newton Winchell, who was the first state geologist of Minnesota and is a giant in my field. I mean, I learned about Winchell when I was my first year in college. But I didn't know anything about his work on the Kensington Runestone until after I had reached my own conclusion. And when I found out that he had studied the Runestone, I got nervous. I thought, oh my God, what if he has a different conclusion? Well, he didn't. And in fact, when I did finally read his work, he did an amazing job. And he did a relative age weathering study similar to what I did. It was different, but he chose to go down the same path of doing a comparative weathering study. And in the end, he concluded that the weathering was old and that the stone was genuine. Of course, I was pretty happy to hear this when I finally realized we did come to the same conclusion. But you know what, Henrik, I really shouldn't have been nervous because, that's how science works. It has to be reproducible. So really, there's a lot of people that are saying, wow, you saw the Kensington Runestone. And I say, no, I didn't. Newton Winchell did it 90 years before I did, and he didn't have the fancy equipment that I did, the scanning electron microscopes and X-ray diffraction, infrared spectrometry, and so on, but yet he came to the same conclusion. And it's interesting that here we are, two hard science people that are practicing in geology, and we stand alone in contrast to people in archaeology, anthropology, history, language, linguistics, all wonderful disciplines, and I don't mean to be disrespectful to them because they're wonderful fields. But the fact of the matter is they don't receive formal training in the scientific method, and it shows. And I think that's really the fundamental difference between why myself and Newton Winchell and other geologists that have reviewed my work say that the stone is old, and then logic tells you it has to be genuine. And what that means, what that means is if the stone is genuine, then everything in that inscription must also be genuine. In other words, everything in that inscription has to be consistent with the 14th century. And again, this is a simple deductive logic. And what I would say to the academics is, you guys are missing out on one of the most incredible opportunities of your life. I mean, for somebody like Henrik Williams, here's the first, runestone found in this country that's absolutely genuine. It's a long text. It's got all kinds of things that you can learn from.
Yeah.
And others can learn from, but yet they've treated it like a piece of crap for over 100 years, and it's just
they
beyond
assume it's
disappointing.
Fake. They assume it's fake just because it's just not possible according to what they've learned so far, right? That's
well,
it.
Guess what? I think all of us, as we go through our lives, realize as we get older, there's more and more that we don't know, even though we continue to acquire knowledge. And I think that attitude has a lot to do with it.
Yeah. Well, it's an amazing story. Why don't we just talk a little bit about what is contained on the stone, of course, and what it points to for those who don't know, Scott.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you the latest translation, and I'm sure it's going to change as it has throughout time. But the basic message is pretty much the same. And it says 8 Goths and 22 Norman, which some people have translated as Norwegians, and I'm beginning to wonder if it is Norman, in fact. But 8 Goths and 22 Norman on this acquisition business or taking up land far to the west of Vinland, we had camped near two shelters, 1 day's journey north from the stone. We were fishing one day. When we came home, found 10 men red with blood and death, and then 3 Latin letters, AVM. And then the last line says, save from evils. On the split side of the stone, it was cleaved off before the inscription was carved from a much larger stone. It says, there are 10 men by the sea with our ships, 14 days' journey from this island, year 1362. And, Henrik, there is one little quick story I'd like to tell your listeners.
Sure.
To give additional context to the issue that the runologists have had. For over 100 years, the chief piece of linguistic evidence against the runestone was the first word on the split side, H-A-R in runes. Har, have 10 men by the sea with our ships. And unfortunately, that is a modern Swedish word.
Yeah, sure is.
And they beat the stone up for 100 years with that being their crown jewel. When I did my photo study of the runestone in 2002, at that time I knew nothing about runes, okay? And all I did was document the physical characters, every one of them. I took 650 photographs under high angle and low angle reflected light. And I found all kinds of things that people had never seen before because nobody had ever looked carefully because it was a fake, right?
Yeah.
Who's going to waste time on a fake?
Yeah.
But I knew it was real. And I knew that it had to be looked at carefully. And before any linguist can tell us what it says, you have to know what's there. And I found all these weird punch marks and short strokes. And I also found 2 dots above the A in the word har that had never been seen before. I didn't know what the hell they were, and I sure as heck didn't know what they meant. But I remember people going, wait a minute, are you sure? I said, well, look at them. There they are. And sure enough, they were there. But guess what that did? That changed the word har to hair. There are 10 men by the sea with our ships, and guess what? That's an old Swedish word. So suddenly the most the most powerful piece of evidence against the stone is gone. Now, I'm not surprised by this, okay? I didn't know what I'd found. I didn't know what it was. I just said, there's 2 dots there. Just look at them. There they are. They're clearly man-made. And they're umlauts. But this just goes to show, and giving the early linguists credit, when they first looked at it, it had just been pulled out of the ground. It was probably still filled with mud. And those in that split side has a rougher texture than the face side where the first 9 lines are because of the foliation of the rock. It's a geologic aspect of the rock that makes that surface rougher and harder to see those dots. Mm-hmm. So, all this can be explained through logic. And what I don't understand is why people aren't acknowledging this.
I know. Well, it's amazing, isn't it? I mean, the land which is mentioned on the stone is real. We know that the Vikings were in North America way before our buddy Chris Columbus was there. So this is this is a scientifically accepted fact to this day. And so why not the continuation? Why not the possibility that they went further from that place?
Well, there's a couple points here. One is what academia wants us to believe today is that the Norse were here, the Vikings were here in the year 1000. And then they want us to believe that nothing happened for 500 years until Chris came over.
Yeah.
I mean, does that even pass the smell test?
Not in my book, no.
Not in my book. I mean, it's like, are you kidding me? And when obviously I've gone down the road to figure out who these people were and why they came over here. And the fundamental thing that's obvious is that these people went to great lengths to keep their activities secret. Okay? Mm-hmm. And if you stop and think about it, it's an oversimplification, but I think it's apropos. If you've got a great hunting spot or fishing spot, are you going to tell anybody?
Well, depends also on the climate